So just about 2 weeks ago, something really exciting in the world of sports happened, something that nobody ever thought was ever going to take place, ever. LeBron James passed 40,000 points as a professional basketball player. That's an unheard of number that had never taken place beforehand. The long-standing record before that was just over 38,000 points, and that was handled by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And for the longest time, nobody ever thought anybody was getting anywhere close to 38,000, let alone surpass it, and then pass a whole new milestone. Whether you like LeBron or not, we still have to admit that this is quite a feat. And even those who are outside of sports, if you're indifferent towards basketball or LeBron James entirely, it's still an impressive thing to consider that a guy has been around the league long enough to score this much and still be at the top of his game at approaching 40 years of age, when most athletes are retired for a few years. It's actually been kind of interesting to see that most of the guys that LeBron came into the league with have long since retired, and yet he's continuing to go and reaching these amazing milestones. But this feat of passing 40,000 points has kind of re-sparked a debate that's been going on for about a decade now. And it's the question of who is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. Is it LeBron or is it Michael Jordan? This is a fun debate that's been going on among sports fans for a very long time. It's not only been going on among sports fans, this has taken place among sports analysts. This has taken place among, just guys who have random podcasts for reasons that never are explained. This has been taking place even amongst players who have had careers that have spanned it long enough to play against both Michael and LeBron. It's the question of who is the GOAT. There's arguments on both sides, and it's amazing to me, as somebody who just doesn't care about arguing, how passionate people get about this debate. I've seen it boil down in some cases where you're worried that what started off as a friendly conversation between two buddies is about to escalate to a point of let's see each other in the parking lot outside. They would get so passionate about who is the GOAT. It's this debate going on. Who's the greatest of all time, Michael or LeBron, even though everybody knows the right answer is Magic Johnson. Fight me. All right, anyway. But we kind of like to have this same GOAT debate in various other places as well. It's not just in basketball. Right now, because of LeBron's accomplishment, that's the most passionately debated one. But we have this debate in other areas of sports, whether it's Montana or Brady, who happens to be the best quarterback. Right now, we're getting Mahomes in there. I think that's too early. Give the kid some time. But anyway, we'll argue about whether or not they're the greatest quarterback. We'll argue whether Gretzky or Ovechkin is the greatest hockey players, for you hockey enthusiasts. We'll argue whether Hank Aaron or Mickey Mantle was the best baseball player, and on and on and on. We'll have these debates about who's the GOAT in these areas. We'll have these same kind of debates over things that are completely outside of sports as well. Elvis or Frank Sinatra? The Beatles or the Stones? We'll have these debates about actors and actresses, Al Pacino or Robert De Niro, Meryl Streep or Jodie Foster, on and on. We'd like to debate these sorts of things as to who's the greatest of all time. We'll even go so far as to debate who is the greatest actor or actress to play the same character. Who's the best Superman? The answer is obviously Christopher Reeve, but Dean Cain is a close second in my mind. Does anybody remember who Dean Cain was? Yeah. We watched through Lois and Clark whenever I was in college, and my roommate and I, we just loved how bad an actor Dean Cain is. And we would say that most men want to be Superman. Superman wishes he was Dean Cain. So, we'll debate who's the best James Bond, which is, Sean Connery. Come on. How do you top? Timothy Dalton is a close second for me. I think if he'd had like 2 or 3 more movies, we'd all remember him a lot more. But if you go back and you watch the Timothy Dalton Bond movies, they're so cool. We'll debate over who's the best Batman. It's Michael Keaton. It's not even. We'll even go so far as to debate who was the GOAT of all the presidents. And before we step on that landmine, settle down. I think we can at least all come to the agreement that it is not William Henry Harrison. When you're only president for 31 days, you don't get mentioned in the conversation. But we have different criteria for each one of these GOAT debates, whether it be who scored the most points, who won the most championships, who has the most overall individual awards, or just who's your personal favorite. We all have those kinds of things. Sometimes we can't express what it is that makes us think that they're so great, but we just know it. We feel it in our bones. We know the way they make us feel. And so because of that, we consider them to be the GOAT, even though nobody else even knows who they are. We just have these debates in our own eyes. We are constantly comparing people against one another and asking those around us, sometimes even just asking ourselves, who is the greatest? And there's something about nearly all of us, I think, that has an inner desire to become the greatest ourselves. Right? We all have this kind of drive within us that we want to become the best possible that we can be. We want to become the greatest. If you got a certain career, maybe you want to be the greatest accountant of all time. I mean, that's an achievement, I suppose. Or maybe you want to be the best nurse ever. We want to become the greatest of all sorts of things. If we got a certain hobby, you want to become the greatest woodworker, or maybe the greatest knitter of all time, whatever your hobby happens to be. Maybe you're the best underwater basket weaver. I don't know. If that's you, knock yourself out. Don't literally do that because you're underwater. And anyway, we're all over the place today, kids. If you've got kids, you want to be the greatest parent you can be. If you got grandkids, you want to be the best grandparent of all time. There's something about us in our human nature that we don't want to just be good at whatever it is that we're doing. We want to be the absolute best. We want to be considered the greatest. And we'll even carry this sort of mindset with us into church. Come on now. You can't tell me that you honestly haven't sat there some Sundays and kind of looked around the room and thought, am I better than everybody? Am I the greatest Christian in this room? We'll look around and we'll compare ourselves to everyone around us. We'll compare the way that we're dressed to those around us as if somehow the clothing makes you more spiritual than everybody else. We might sit there and we might say, well, I can't pray out loud as good as he can, but I know for a fact I read my Bible more than she does. Like there are times without thinking about it even that we view our faith as if it's a competition and we just have to know who's the greatest. Now, you may be sitting there and you may already feel convicted, so let me give you a little bit of let up on my stomping on your feet today and let you know you're not alone in this thought. In fact, that discussion of who is the greatest follower of Jesus is kind of the catalyst for the text that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 18, so go ahead and get turned there in your Bibles if you would. But we got a little ground to cover between where we left things off last week and before we get to Matthew 18 today. There's not a lot of ground to cover because we kind of left things off pretty close to where we're at, but there are two major things that take place from where we left things off in Matthew 16 last week until we get to today in Matthew 18. Two major events that we would be doing a disservice to the narrative if we just overlooked them entirely. The first really big thing, the first major event that takes place, probably didn't seem like that big a deal in the moment. See, after Jesus goes off where we left things last week and he tells the disciples to avoid the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees because they've just asked for yet another sign of who Jesus is. Before Jesus lets up on that, he kind of turns the table a little bit and he asks the disciples, who do people say that I am? Right? These Pharisees wanted another sign to find out my identity, so who does everybody else say that I am? And he kind of gets a list of the usual suspects, right? He's told, well, maybe you're Elijah, maybe you're John the Baptist, because not everybody had a chance to go see John, so maybe they thought he was John. Some of them say, well, maybe you're one of the other prophets. But then Jesus kind of turns everything on its head in Matthew 16, verse 15, because then he points to his disciples directly and he says, but you... He asked them, who do you say that I am? This is the first time that Jesus has ever bluntly asked these men who have been following after him now for quite a while, who do you say that I am? And it's amazing to me, and we've reflected on this in the past, that Peter is the one who chimes in. But I think when Peter does so, he's speaking for the group. He's saying something that all of them at least suspect, if not know for a fact. It says in verse 16, he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Understand, this is the first time a human being ever confessed the true identity of Jesus. Right? Up till now, everybody has assumed and believed that Jesus is just a teacher, he's a rabbi, he's somebody to admire, he's a miracle worker. But this is the first time that human lips have ever uttered the phrase, "You are the Messiah." This is not a moment that we can just breeze past, because the fact remains, for all of us, either Jesus is who Peter confessed him to be, or he's not. Those are the choices that we as human beings get to make. I think this is, of all the questions that we ever ask ourselves in life, this is one of the most important questions that we ever ask. Who is Jesus? Because the answer to that question is going to shape and mold the rest of our lives. The way we answer that particular question has tremendous weight behind it, and it should not be asked lightly. And so Peter confessing that Jesus is the Messiah is a huge moment in time. But in light of that particular moment, if there were any lingering doubts among the disciples, if maybe one of them had said, "Well, I don't know about that, Pete. Jesus is a great guy, but the Messiah, I'm not so sure." If there were any of those lingering doubts, they are about to be erased forever, completely removed. Because shortly after Peter confesses who Jesus is, Jesus takes Peter and a couple of the other disciples to the top of a mountain. And when they get there, they see Jesus completely transform. All of a sudden, his face starts to glow. His clothes become super bright white. He becomes this entirely different thing in front of them. And then all of a sudden, Elijah and Moses are standing among them. Please understand, Elijah and Moses at this point in time have each been dead for quite some time. And these are two of the most important, the most well-respected, the most read prophets of God ever. And so the fact that Jesus is standing there and he is transformed in front of them, that in and of itself is already a huge moment for these disciples. But to see Elijah and Moses come amongst their midst, something special is happening. I've always been a little bit curious, how do they know it was Moses and Elijah? Right? They didn't have photographs of the two of them. So how do you know it's them? But whatever it is, there's just an ingrained knowledge in these disciples. These aren't just regular guys who just happened to climb the same mountain we did. And even more than that, they get to hear the voice of God himself. They get to hear him proclaim exactly who Jesus is. In chapter 17, verse 5, it says, "While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him.'" This is such a big moment in the life of these disciples. They've already come to the belief that Jesus is the Messiah. Now they've got concrete proof, right? They just heard the voice of God himself say, "This is my Son." And so this is a huge moment that takes place, because this is confirmation of everything these disciples have believed. I don't know about you, but I kind of want that sometimes. I wish I had this kind of mountaintop moment where I heard the voice of God speak to me directly and say, "Jesus is my Son." Right? It'd be really hard to fall out of faith if you experience that moment, right? But even after these events take place, even after these moments have happened, and even after these thoughts are probably still swimming in the disciples' brains, they're still trying to process everything that's just happened, we kind of get to where we are today. Because they start to ask these questions about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. If Jesus is who he says he is, and he's going to be setting up this whole new kingdom of heaven, well, who's going to be the greatest among them? Who's the GOAT? And Jesus answers this kind of unexpectedly. It says this in Matthew chapter 18, verse 1. It says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and they asked, 'So who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?'" This seems like a pretty blunt way to put this, right? Matthew paints this particular passage, this particular question, like it was just sort of an, "Oh, by the way." But the Gospel of Mark gives us a whole different idea, because Mark has the similar story in his Gospel. He writes about the same experience that's taking place here, but he has a little different twist and a different perspective. In Mark chapter 9, verses 33 and 34, it says, "They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" So Jesus asked the disciples, "Hey, there was an argument going on amongst you. What were you arguing about?" And I love the way this is answered. In verse 34, "But they were silent, because on the way they'd been arguing with one another about who is the greatest." There are some biblical scholars who believe that the disciples were probably in their late teens. They were 18, 17, that time frame, whatever. Moments like this kind of give that argument credence, doesn't it? There's nothing like a 17-year-old boy puffing up his chest saying, "I'm the best." They're having this argument and this debate over who is the greatest among them. They're having their own goat debate. But while they're having this discussion, while they're having this moment, and they kind of bring it to Jesus' attention, asking for an answer over who is the greatest, who is the goat in the kingdom of God, Jesus does something unexpected. Verse 2 says he called a small child and had him stand among them. I want you to understand why this is such an unusual development that Jesus would do. We live in a very child-centric culture, right? Parents will pour into their children all the time. Oftentimes we consider our kids to be the most important thing in the world to us. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, in first century Israel, they didn't take the approach that kids are to be seen and not heard. They took the approach of kids are not to be seen or heard. Right? This is a culture where everything about your worth as a human being is wrapped up in what you can offer, what you can bring to the table, what you have that can benefit the rest of us. And I love kids, but kids don't bring a lot to the table. Right? They can't do a whole lot of stuff. They're not as capable as we are as human beings. I'm trying to choose my words quite carefully because my own children are right over there. So the idea that Jesus brings a child out, this would be something that would be shocking to that first century crowd because they didn't have their kids front and center like we do. Some of that could have been like self-preservation because they're living in a time period where they don't have access to the same kind of health care that we have, and it wasn't uncommon for children to die at young ages, and so maybe parents just didn't want to get overly attached. But Jesus brings this child out, and he has him stand right in front of them. He has him become the focal point of the entire room. And he says this in verse 3, he says, "Truly I tell you, unless you turn and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." This is, without a doubt, the pin drop moment of Jesus' lesson here. What Jesus has just said is not just shocking back then. Let's be honest, it's shocking today, right? As adults, we spend most of our time raising our children, trying to train them to be more like us. Right? We teach them how to do things like hold a spoon, how to be able to use the bathroom on their own. My children are reaching the age right now where I try to, if I'm doing a home repair, I'll pull them into the room with me so I can show them how to do this sort of thing. We had to patch up a part of our wall not too long ago, so I pulled the two of them into the room and saying, "Here's how you do this," because I want them to know how to handle it so that way whenever they have a house of their own, barring that the housing market doesn't completely implode, that they can fix this on their own, that they can be self-sufficient, that they know how to do this. I want them to learn these things from me so that they can become better than me, hopefully. And yet here's Jesus telling us that if we want to become great in the kingdom of heaven, we got to be more like a kid. I don't know about you, I struggle with that. With that idea that if I want to become great in the kingdom of heaven, instead of my children becoming more like me, I got to become more like my children. That's a difficult pill for us to swallow. It's something that's difficult for us to understand. But Jesus goes on to explain what he means, to give us more indication as to what he's talking about in verse 4. He says, "Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child, this one is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Probably like me, if you've heard sermons on this particular text before, they usually land in the idea that we need to have faith like a child. And while there's certainly credence to that thought, and we could talk more about that, I don't think that's the overall point that Jesus is trying to make. Because Jesus doesn't point out this child because of his faith. He doesn't point out this child because of what this child believes. He points out this child because of the humility of this child. Because children, by design, by nature, are very humble things. It takes them a long time to learn how to not be so humble. Or if they're my children, it doesn't take them long at all. But Jesus is attempting to the point that he's trying to make here is that these children tend to have more humility than we tend to as adults, particularly in our culture. He's telling his followers that if we want to find true greatness, it's not going to come from what we strive for. It's not going to come from what we accomplish. Rather, it's going to come when we willingly take the lowest position. The illustration that he uses for the culture that he's in is to use a child because a child was the lowest in their culture. They didn't have anything else to offer the rest of the community, and so they were not really that important to anyone. I'm sure their mother cared a lot for them, probably their father as well, but beyond that, they didn't have anything else to offer the whole community, and so therefore they were someone in the lower positions. He also adds the notion of the attitude of this child. Tim Keller, he passed away last year, a well-respected pastor and theologian, in his reflections on this particular text and the notion that Jesus is trying to come across here, he said, quote, "Children have a total lack of grasp on social status. When children encounter other children, they don't worry about their economic position. They're not worried about how much money does this kid have. They're not worried about what kind of clothes is this kid wearing. I used to marvel at my daughters. I still marvel at them today, but particularly when they were little and I'd take them to the park or we'd go to the grocery store or something like that. My kids, no matter where we went, they made a friend. If we were at the park and there was another kid there, that kid got roped into whatever my kids were doing, sometimes whether or not that kid wanted to be or not. They were going to make a buddy. Didn't matter where. If we're at the grocery store, they would encounter every single adult. They would say hi to random strangers. They didn't care. They didn't have any understanding about who this person was or how much money do they make or where do they stand on the social ladder or can they offer anything to me. They just made a friend. They didn't care about any of the stuff that you and I normally care about. All they saw was somebody that they could talk to, that they could engage with. And in the culture that Jesus is offering this thought, this would have been considered so backwards to the notion of everything that they understood about their world. We know that people in this time period would really only associate themselves with people who could benefit them. We know for a fact that they would completely reject and even ostracize people who had a bad reputation. People who had a reputation for their sinful behavior. People who had a reputation for, in the case of tax collectors, what they did for a living. These people would not only be ignored by society, they would be flat out rejected and sometimes be asked to leave that town. Because people did not want to associate with these people's reputation. They didn't want to be seen having this conversation with them. And conversely, they wanted to associate with people who had great reputations. Right? They would follow after Pharisees because they wanted to be associated with that Pharisee. It was a high honor to be able to invite that rabbi or that teacher to come to your house to have dinner because then you get to throw it in your neighbors' faces. Look who we got coming to dinner. We're pretty important. And yet here's Jesus saying instead of this idea of separating people out based on their social standings, you got to let go of that. You have to be humble enough to accept everybody at the same level. Just like a child does, somebody who doesn't care. Jesus, we know for a fact that he demonstrated this to us over and over and over again. Because the people that others would reject in that society, Jesus wouldn't just be seen associating with. Oftentimes, Jesus would go out of his way to find them, to go be around them, to make sure that everybody saw, I'm associating with this guy that y'all kicked out. I'm hanging around this gal, even though I know what she does for a living. He would be associated with these people who had bad reputations. He would treat them as if they had honor and dignity and respect, even though the rest of their society would reject them entirely and not treat them with any sort of respect. Jesus demonstrated this same thing, and here he is saying that our mindset needs to be the same humility as a child who loves and cares for everyone. In verse 5, Jesus goes even further into this thought. There he says, whoever welcomes one child like this in my name welcomes me. If we are willing to welcome in the lowest part of our society, the lowest quadrant of who we have around us, the lowest point, if we welcome them in and give them that honor and give them the respect, then Jesus says we're welcoming him into all these things. He's saying that if you're humble enough to treat people equally, regardless of whether or not association with them can benefit you, then you're welcoming in him. If Jesus has been made the center of your life, if you are truly seeking out him and his truth, then it's going to be seen in his followers by the way they treat others. They won't look down on anyone for any reason. Rather, they'll treat them with the same love and the same respect, seeking to elevate everyone. Verse 10, Jesus says, see to it that you don't despise one of these little ones, because I tell you that in heaven their angels continually view the face of my Father in heaven. How we treat other people matters. Jesus set that example over and over again, that we needed to have the same humility to treat everyone that we come across with dignity and respect, regardless of their social standing, regardless as to what they have to offer us personally. We are meant as his followers to treat them all. The fact is that this is still an issue today. Time may have passed, but people remain pretty much the same. You and I have been guilty of treating certain people better than we do others. Again, I'm going to throw my hand right up here. I've done this. I have been this. When we see someone with money or status or some sort of fame of some kind, the markings of what you and I consider to be greatness, we fawn over them. We shower them with praise. We do everything that we can to make sure that we have some kind of an association with them. But that's not how Jesus defines true greatness. Jesus tells us that true greatness in his kingdom comes from the humility to treat everyone around us like they matter, like they have value, like they're welcome amongst us. Maybe the issue is that we don't understand what true humility really is. We have this misguided notion that to be humble means that I have to talk badly about myself, right? If somebody tells you, hey, you look nice in that sweater today, you say, I just kind of threw it on. If somebody tells us something that's some sort of faint praise, we like to just degrade ourselves a little bit, right? But that's not what humility is. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And instead seeking to put the needs of everyone else around you, to make sure that everyone else around you is elevated and lifted up. It's caring for others more than you care about yourself, and that's going to be demonstrated in the way that we treat other people, regardless of where they stand on the social ladder. Right? If some sort of a celebrity were to walk in here right now, we would probably fawn all over them. You guys probably wouldn't be listening to what I'm saying too much, right? You'd be kind of just like, can you believe they're here? But if somebody who maybe smells a little differently, maybe somebody who's dressed in stuff that we don't consider to be appropriate for outside, if they make their way around us, we're going to avoid them, aren't we? Jesus says that if we want to be great in his kingdom, we have to have the humility to treat others the same. To elevate those around us, to be able to be around everyone. That is a big word, right? That means that we have to have the humility to welcome in those that we don't like. A guy at work who just makes you miserable, if he made his way in here, Jesus tells us we have to have the humility to welcome him in. That girl that we just can't stand, that we think dresses a little too provocatively, that we think just doesn't belong anywhere in here, if she makes her way in here, we have to have the humility to make sure that she feels welcomed amongst us too. With the same level of enthusiasm, the same level of love as we show to each other. And we still wrestle with this. We still wrestle with this in the church on a constant basis. You may have heard this story before. I don't know if this is a true story or not, but it's still a good illustration here. As people were heading into a church on Sunday, they were surprised to see a homeless man sitting outside their building. The clothes that he was wearing looked like they didn't even know what a washing machine was. They were torn, they were tattered, they were dirty. As they passed by him, they could smell the alcohol coming off of him. They could smell that he had just lived a rough life. He'd been run ragged and put up wet. His beard was matted and there were clearly food elements stuck to it. Hey, it happens, okay? But he was standing out there outside of them. As members of the church filed in, they did their best not to stare, not to make eye contact, but rather go on as if he wasn't there. Just before the service began, several noticed that he made his way inside the building, that he slid into the back pew. The people sitting near that area scooted away to make sure he had a wide berth around him. Those that couldn't scoot away, they suddenly found better seats elsewhere and got up and moved. After the worship and the announcements, one of the church elders got up to introduce the new minister the church had just hired. And as people were applauding, that applause faded quickly because this homeless man who had made his way amongst them got up and made his way down the aisle. He stood behind the pulpit and introduced himself as their new minister. And as he did so, he recounted his experiences with the church that morning. And he said the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 25, verses 34 through 44. He said, "Then the king will say to those on their right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' And then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did you see you a stranger and take you in, or without clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you didn't take me in. I was naked, and you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't take care of me.' Then they too will answer, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or without clothes or sick or in prison and not help you?' And then he will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me.'" How you and I treat people. Again, that big word, everyone, matters to Jesus. If you and I want to truly be great in the kingdom of heaven, if we want God to consider us to be great, it happens when we are humble enough and we demonstrate that humility in how we treat others. The Apostle Paul would write in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, and we'll close with it this morning. "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. everyone should look not to his own interests, but rather to the interests of others.